In this video, we'll talk about how to use URLSession data task to interact with a web API. Here we have a very simple demo app. Basically, what's going to do is when I tap this play button, it should load a Pokemon object from a remote, actually not remote, from a web API. Here we have a very lovely Python server written in Flask. Basically, it reads the ID from its URL request parameter and then use that ID to load a specific Pokemon JSON object from the Pokemons.json file that you see for mini project 2. So for example, if my ID is 0, if my ID is 1, it should be mapped to 0 right here. It will give us this JSON object and return it as the HTTP server response. Here, because it's a Python, it's a Flask, so all you need to do is just run Flask run in your terminal. Here we can actually verify this using what's called a Postman. It's a free application that's pretty commonly used in web API testing. Here we're going to use a GET, the protocol HTTPS, and the host is localhost 127.0.0.1. Port is 5000. We can actually get this from the Flask output. And then this Pokemon is known as path. We'll get that from the server script. It's defined as the route right here. Then this, because it's expecting an ID number passed in as a parameter, we have to have it right here. We'll have it right here. If we click send, it will return the Pokemon JSON object in the server response. If we hit 2, and it's basically doing what we expected. Now the focus for today is how do we do the same thing on iOS? How do we use the frameworks at our disposal to make HTTP response that we did in Postman? And again, this is a very simple view controller that has a single button. It's actually a special button called load button, because after that we'll demo, how delayed server response should look like in our UI, so that users don't get confused while our content is loading. So we have a loading button that will show an activity indicator while it's loading, and we add it to the center of our screen. So it basically looks like this. Here our focus will focus on creating this fetch Pokemon function that will do most of the heavy lifting for us. And the first thing we're going to think about is what the parameter is going to look like. And the first thing that comes to your mind should be it's going to have the ID number for the Pokemon. So here we're actually going to say with ID, use the functional parameter, the arguments label to make it more explicit. And after that, the first step will be create a URL. This is going to be the URL that we'll be using to make our GET request, just like that one right here. However, we're going to do it slightly differently using a URL components. URL components is like a tool for you to compose a URL from a bunch of components, and it can come very handy when we have a variable parameter like this one, the ID. Here we're going to initialize the URL components with a string. Technically, you can do everything. You can initialize everything using a string, but that will kind of defeat the purpose of using a URL components, right? So I'm actually going to show you like the different feature of URL components without having like initialize everything from a string. So here we create a URL components that has this protocol and host, and we're gonna add other stuff dynamically, like this. So URL components dot path. Remember path. Sorry, I need to unwrap this. So path is the resource path in the server, and here we can get it from our Pokemon.py file, and it's saying the path is /Pokemons. So this is what we're gonna add. Path equal to a string slash Pokemons. And we're also going to add the query items. So it's going to be query items equals to an array of query item is basically array of URL query item, which is basically a fancy name for key value pair. The key is ID. The value is the integer ID that's passed in, but we need to convert that to string. And finally, we still have to convert our URL components into the actual URL object. And it's done like this: URL components.url. Because it's a optional, usually you need to conditional unwrap it. Here, for the sake of this this demo, we could just stick with force unwrap. And the next step is actually very important. You want to have a data task, and the data task is initialized from URLSessions. URLSessions is the overarching class for individual task, which carry out the connection to which handles the connections to the server, and a session can manage multiple data tasks. You can initialize a session using a session configuration, such as default, and background and other stuff. We'll not talk about the difference here because they're pretty much pretty similar. And most of the time you can stick to configuration default. For a simpler task like this, using a shared singleton would probably suffice. So here we're just gonna use a shared data task. So here's another important feature of URLSessions. It has different kinds of tasks. Most likely you will encounter data task and download task. Data task is where you load remote resource into your memory, and the download task is usually used when you're loading something into storage, such as like a file or an image or something like that. Data task is usually for for memory. Here we're going to initialize a data task with a URL using this initializer. And then next step is very important. We want to have a completion, a handler that handles the returns of the data task. The completion has 3 positional arguments. The first one is data, second one is response, and the third one is error. Well, they all have specific types, but usually I would just like to name them so that I know which one is which. And one very important thing when about like handling server basically any network request is that you always want to handle error. Is unlike a closure will have a lot of control over which is nil, which is not. When it comes to networking, like Wi-Fi goes, when Wi-Fi goes bad, like cell phone lose signal, something like that happens, and error are much more frequent than you'll see, like when you're handling closure internally, like we did before. So the first thing you usually want to do is to check whether this error is nil, because when error is not nil, that usually means something is wrong. So if you hover like this, actually you can't. So if first thing we're gonna do is gonna conditionally bind error into another error variable. So basically conditional force unwrap this error thing. If let error equals to error, we'll print out the error. We'll first say error, and then we'll print error.localize description. And we're gonna return because there's no point of continuing forward when there's an error. And in the other case, else, we also want to check if we can actually read the data and response of these 2 variables, because these 2 variables is still optional, and we want to unwrap it. So we're going to use a guard let data equal data, and then response equal to response. Here what we did is we unwrap these 2 optional, and then using a guard let statement. In addition to that, we also want to unwrap this and conditionally typecast it as HTTP URL response, because this response object was passed in as URL response. However, we know that we are using HTTP when communicating with our server, and in return, it will return an HTTP response. So we can narrow it down sort of by typecasting it into HTTP URL response. And in fact, it's going to give us the properties, the attributes associated with an HTTP response object, such as status code, that will be useful later on. And after the first step, we're going to print if you cannot read these two, that means there's something wrong and you want to handle it. So we're going to print error, just as before. And this time we will say couldn't read response object. Sounds good. And also return it. And we also want to check whether our response status code equals to 200. Because, when it's not 200, even if there is a response, it might not be, it might not have valid data inside. So we want to also check for that. So I say response.status code equal 200. Make sure that it's 200, the status is 200. Or else we're going to print also error. Server responded status code response dot status code, just like that, and also return. Good thing of using guardless statements is I always remind you that you should return after if the guard condition is not met. Unlike this if-let statement, if you don't return, the compiler won't yell at you, which is sometimes not what you want. And after that, we make sure that everything is good to go. We can start decoding our Pokemon. So we're just gonna do the same thing as we did for the Pokemon generator for MP2. We're gonna initialize a JSON decoder. And this decoder is gonna decode our Pokemon into a Pokemon object. Pokemon.self from the data. Data is the payload data that got unwrapped right here. Just like that. And now we have our Pokemon instance. But very importantly, what we're going to do with the Pokemon instance, right? And this is where a completion will come in handy when we're thinking like what's going to pass into the fetch Pokemon function. Here we're going to make a completion so that we can call it after the data task is done, right? And here we're going to say completion. And we are going to make the type of the completion to be taking a Pokemon and returning nothing. So if we just do completion like this, it will not allow us because this completion is not escaping. Since data task is a asynchronous call, the URLSession shared data task is an asynchronous call. This thing would essentially outlive the function that was passed in. And if you recall our definition for completion closure, right before you opened up this video, you'll know that this completion has to be escaping, right? And you immediately realize that you need to have a escaping, this escaping notation right here in order to be able to call it later on. Now, there is another way of circumventing this. Actually, it's not like it's not like a workaround, more like a syntactic sugar. Is that you can use an optional completion to replace the escaping notation. And it is because optional closure inside a function, inside the function parameter they are automatically escaping. So you don't have to make it escaping. They are escaping by default, right? So here is also valid. The downside is you have to, unwrap it. I mean, it's sort of it's kind of not a downside. I feel like, it's just like something you gotta do. Now we have our fetch Pokemon function ready. Actually, we still have one more step to do. Here we initialize the data task. We actually need to start that data task, because just by initialization, it doesn't mean that like you're doing anything. You just initialized it. You still have to manually start telling the data task, okay, you start making the request now, by calling data task.resume. Well, this seems a little bit counterintuitive at first, like why it has to be resume, right? And it has to do with the fact that data task can be paused and resume. Usually we wouldn't make a data task as a local variable, because we'll lose reference for it later on. Usually we'll make it a more something like a what's it called, the instance variable, such as this. I actually don't remember what type it is. It's URL session dot data task. Let's see what's in this variable. URL session. Okay, URL session data task. So it's a URL session data task, just like that. And let's make it an optional, right? Usually we'll have an instance variable and we will assign it to the instance variable, so that in the future we'll be able to like pause it if we like. Right now we don't need to pause it. We could just like fetch Pokemon and say resume, and then off they go, right? But in some cases, especially when you have like a data task that might take a while, you sometimes might want to pause it. And data task, for data task you just say data task.pause. Actually, it's not data task.pause. But actually you could just call a specific function on the data task. You could just look at it by yourself, and it will be able to pause, and you can cancel as well. But anyway, you have to call data task to resume after initializing the data, after you initialize the data task object. And then finally, in our the tab button, we also wanted to call the fetch Pokemon, right? So to call fetch Pokemon, we could just say fetch Pokemon with an ID. Let's make it random, shall we? So say int.random range 0 ... I actually forgot like how many Pokemons are there. I'm pretty sure it's more than 400. So random 0 to 400, and use a trailing closure syntax, and let's say Pokemon, call it Pokemon in, and let's print the Pokemon's name, Pokemon.name, and let's also make our button. Let's also change the texture of our button in a dispatch queue. Do we need a dispatch queue? Yeah, I don't think we need a dispatch queue. So we could just say self dot button. Let's say it needs to hide loading, and then self button dot set image. Set it to what, check mark, and for normal dot self dot button dot background color equal to green. Okay, so here we start to fetch the Pokemon, and we passed in the closure that will be needed after the data task is done. Oh, sorry, system name, forgot about this. And here we can say button dot show loading. This will show the activity indicator in the button. Okay. If we take a look at that right now, so here is actually another example of we might want to use weak self in this case, you know, like, because we talked about it, like if you want to avoid delayed deallocation, you should use weak self. Let's just use weak self. And here, if we tab it, it should first change it to the loading status, and then change it to green and check mark once it's done, and then print the Pokemon. Well, something didn't work. Let's see. Should be called in a background thread. Okay, actually we do need. Oh wait, yeah, because the URL session is not executing on the main queue, so we do need the dispatch queue. Okay, dispatch queue dot main dot async or sync. I don't think it matters in this case. Just like that, and we'll be able to, you know, get our expected behavior. Yep, and you see it change into the activity state for a brief period of time, and then change it and then change back into the and then transitioned to the check mark and green background. Now we can actually make it more obvious by adding a sleep inside our Python code so that you guys can see the transition a little bit better. So I think it's time.sleep and sleep for 2 seconds. I need to rerun it, the Flask. And you should see the server wait for 2 seconds before it responds, and from our client standpoint, it looks like the server is, you know, like thinking or loading, and for 2 seconds, and then, you know, return the Pokemon. All right, so that's the end of this video. I will see you next time.